So if you've been watching my channel a while, you know that I have been covering a lot of Hollywood news, but I kind of want to, I've got some stories that are outside of just Hollywood. I'm still going to be covering Hollywood stuff this week, but I've got a couple more things on my plate. And the first one, which is a huge one, the NLRB has ruled that if bosses commit unfair labor practices in the run-up to a union election, then the election will be canceled and the board will order the employer to immediately recognize and bargain with the union. Union busting just got a lot harder. Jeff Bezos is seething right now. Oh man, this is huge. This is like probably one of the biggest changes to labor rights in decades. Probably the biggest change to labor rights since like Reagan. Yeah, now every union campaign has to go to an election to get formal recognition, but bosses use that time to union bust, often illegally. Now, if a majority of workers support the union, bosses will have to stop union busting or be forced to negotiate with no election at all. As the chair of the NLRB states, it eliminates incentives for employers to commit unfair labor practices as a way to delay or defeat representation when a majority of workers have shown support for a union. Bring the board's position closer to the old Joy Silk doctrine, which held that if a majority of workers signed union cards, there didn't need to be an election at all, and bosses just had to recognize the union and bargain in good faith. That is awesome. I am so excited for that. We have been seeing a lot of new unionization stories going on, and a lot of people talking about potential strikes. It feels like there is a real wave of support in general for workers' rights and a lot more support for unions. This right here from the Biden administration is a big step forward for that. And speaking of more unionization going on, and to tie it back into my general Hollywood theme, Walt Disney Pictures VFX workers move to unionize. As we had seen previously, the Marvel Studios VFX team, the in-house team, they are moving to unionize as well. I don't know if they've had their vote on that yet, but we are getting that here as well. Visual effects crews at Walt Disney Studios have taken a significant step to unionize after filing with the NLRB for an election to unionize. A supermajority of the 18 in-house VFX crew members at Walt Disney Pictures signed authorization cards signaling their desire to unionize. The historical move is the second time in history that VFX professionals have joined together to demand the same protections and rights as their colleagues. Earlier this month, VFX crews at Marvel Studios voted to unionize beginning August 21st. Ballots are due on September 11th, and the vote count will take place on September 12th. Today, courageous visual effects workers at Walt Disney Pictures overcame the fear and silence that have kept our community from having a voice on the job for decades. With an overwhelming supermajority of these crews demanding an end to the way VFX has always been, this is a clear sign that our campaign is not about one studio or corporation. It's about VFX workers across the industry using the tools at our disposal to uplift ourselves and forge a better path forward, IATSE VFX organizer Mark Patch said in a statement. Lucky Otter says, is saying we'll keep this up till they lose their mortgage bad faith? Oh, I would say so. But that's a different thing, because that is labor negotiations. Like they've already recognized the union. This is specifically about bosses having to recognize unions. The negotiation itself, it would be interesting to see if the NLRB steps in at some point to force the AMPTP to engage in better good faith. But I have no idea where they're going to move on that. The unions are already recognized, so that's a separate issue, I would say. The determination of these VFX workers is not just commendable, it's groundbreaking. Their collective action against the status quo represents a seismic shift in this critical moment in our industry. The chorus of voices demanding change is unprecedented and demonstrates our united movement is not about any one company, but about setting a precedent of dignity, respect, and fairness for all, International President of IATSE Matthew D. Loeb said. The unionizing VFX workers are responsible for creating the VFX across the studio's catalog, which includes Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and The Lion King. So these are the in-house VFX workers who are probably working on, because a lot of VFX work is done with overseas effects houses these aren't being affected by the unionization, but the in-house ones, they're probably the ones who are doing like the mocap work for these movies. Like it was a team of 18. That's a very small portion of the whole VFX crew that work on these films, and we're probably going to see a big fight ahead before we get to see any kind of union representation for overseas houses. VFX workers have remained non-union since the field was pioneered during production of the first Star Wars films in the 70s and 80s. As part of the move, unionizing workers are demanding fair compensation for all hours worked, adequate health care, retirement benefits, and more generally the same rights and protections afforded to their unionized coworkers who are already represented by IATSE. These demands echo the increasingly prevalent calls for improvements across the VFX industry and are corroborated with the sentiment uncovered by IATSE's 2022 VFX worker rate and conditions survey, which was published in March. With Monday's filing, a labor board election could commence as soon as 2 to 3 weeks. If a majority of these workers vote in favor of unionizing in that election, the studio would be required to begin good faith negotiations for a contract covering these workers as a group. All right. I am very excited to see that. And I know Vosh dad, Mark Kaczynski, is very excited to see this too, because he has been working in VFX for decades. And as Vosh has said, he's basically been like one of the sole voices actually actively pushing for this stuff for a long time. So it's good to see some movement is finally being made on it. As for the union negotiations, WGA AMPTP negotiations in limbo after a week of public sparring. Negotiations between the Writers Guild of America and the major studios remained in limbo on Monday after a week of public sparring failed to result in forward movement. The sides have not formally met since August 18th, when the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers rejected the WGA's August 15th counteroffer. 4 CEOs did meet with a handful of WGA leaders on August 22nd to urge them to accept the studio's counter, which was made on August 11th. I think the 4 CEOs were Bob Iger, David Zaslav, the Netflix CEO, whose name I'm forgetting, and one other person, but basically kind of the biggest ghouls in the industry coming up to the WGA and being like, hey, come on, just we want our billions. We don't want to give you our billions. So let us have our billions. But since then, there has been no move to get back to the negotiating table. As it stands, both sides seem to feel that the other owes them a response. The AMPTP publicly released its counter on August 22nd in a move intended to demonstrate its readiness to make concessions and to put pressure on WGA leadership. The WGA objected to that tactic, saying it was intended to jam negotiators. The union described the AMPTP offer as neither nothing nor nearly enough and cited a host of limitations on several issues. For instance, the studios have offered a guaranteed rewrite for screenwriters, but only on original screenplays under a certain income threshold. That provision would apply to a tiny number of writers, according to the Guild. In its August 15th response, the WGA largely stuck to its original demands, though it did make slight numerical adjustments on some items. The WGA strike is now 119 days old, still a month shy of the 2 longest strikes in Guild history, which took place in 1960 and 1988. There is also no sign of resumption of talks with SAG-AFTRA, which has been on strike for 46 days. Duncan Crabtree Ireland, the union's executive director, told Variety last week that there have been some back-channel talks about how to get back to the table, but no formal communications with the AMPTP. SAG-AFTRA told members in an email on Sunday that the negotiating committee is ready to return to the table at a moment's notice. Unfortunately, as we've seen from the recent news out of the WGA negotiations, it appears the AMPTP is still unwilling to make the concessions necessary to make a fair deal that would bring the strikes to a close, the union said. And here at the end, we are going to note, as I point out frequently, this is an article from Variety, and Variety, Deadline, and Hollywood Reporter are all owned by Penske Media, which also owns Dick Clark Productions, which is a member of the AMPTP. So framing of certain things in these news stories is going to be slanted toward the AMPTP because they have a financial incentive to do so. And at the end of this article, this is where we're going to see it. Because I should point out, this article started out as WGA and AMPTP negotiations in limbo after a week of public sparring, right? So SAG-AFTRA isn't even in the headline. But here we have 4 paragraphs dedicated to something completely unrelated. SAG-AFTRA has faced significant internal pushback over its decision to grant interim agreements to independent producers. Such agreements allow productions to continue despite the strike if they agree to adhere to the union's latest deal points. Some members believe the agreements undermine the solidarity of the strike. Notice how no names are being cited here, just as some members, it doesn't say who. In the message on Sunday, SAG-AFTRA urged members not to make negative comments about actors who are promoting approved indie projects at festivals. Whether from within or without our organization, not only are remarks of this nature unhelpful to performers, but by dividing us, they do the AMPTP's work for them, the union stated. The more projects that get made with the interim agreements, the weaker the AMPTP becomes. So let's lift up our fellow performers who are out there working. More than 300 projects have been granted SAG-AFTRA agreements thus far. Now, the interim agreements with SAG-AFTRA are for independent productions that are not members of the AMPTP. And the way that the interim agreement works is if those independent projects agree to the demands that SAG-AFTRA is demanding of the AMPTP, if they agree to operate under those existing demands, then they can go forward. And this is a great way for independent productions to work to kind of lessen the stranglehold that the AMPTP has in Hollywood. And also it gets us more, more work. And it makes no sense to strike against companies that are willing to agree to all of their demands. And it also helps out people who, it helps out crews who, again, like a lot of members of IATSE is not on strike. And so like they're not getting help from like strike funds because they're not on strike, but functionally they're on strike because without actors and without writers, not a lot of stuff is being made. And with these independent productions, well, members of IATSE can work on those productions as well. And if they're getting filmed right now, that helps them out too. And it's not strike breaking. So I think it's a great thing. There's also productions that are happening overseas, which are, not subject to SAG-AFTRA because SAG-AFTRA is a North American guild. Like, there's a lot of British productions that are still undergoing. Like, I think House of the Dragon Season 2 is allowed to continue filming because it is a British production. So there's things like that. And it's important to recognize what the guild leadership is saying about it. And it's important to note that anytime we see Variety report on criticism that the unions are receiving from within their ranks, they never mention names and they never say how many people they are. But they want to make sure if they hear somebody with criticism to boost that criticism, even if they can't put a face to the criticism. In terms of the independent studios supporting SAG-AFTRA by agreeing to the interim agreements, they're not the only people who are supporting SAG-AFTRA and the WGA. The majority of Americans support the writers and the actors over studios in strikes, Gallup poll finds. Union support remains high among Americans as more than 70% side with the writers. 72% of Americans are more sympathetic to the plight of television and film writers than that of television and film studios amid the strike, according to a Gallup poll released Wednesday. That's compared to 19% who felt more sympathetic toward the members of the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, the group that reps major studios. Additionally, survey respondents felt more sympathetic toward television and film actors at 67%, compared to 24% who sided with the studios. The results come as the Writers Guild of America has been on strike since May 2nd, and SAG-AFTRA has been on strike since July 14th. I think some of this article is going to cover stuff that we already covered, so let me just skim through this one. Yeah, this is all stuff that we have covered with the previous stories, so I don't need to reread the rest of it, but Americans, by and large, support the strike. They support SAG-AFTRA, they support the WGA, because Americans more and more are realizing how screwed over they're getting without labor protections. And even though the media will try and make it seem like half the country is Republican, Republicans are a very small part of the country. I think only like 25% of the country is actually Republican. And even among Republicans, you have the whole narrative of, the blue collar worker, we work hard in the field and stuff like that. And they want labor protections. They might not think that those labor protections come from unions, but if you talk to them about the individual issues that workers are facing, the vast majority of Republicans will actually be on board with what you're talking about, because your average Republican is not some fascist chud. They're just some dude who has been listening to a lot of propaganda, Lucky Otter says, people are waking up, especially in the city. Yes, cities tend to be more progressive than rural areas. That's just a general trend kind of the world over. It is good to see that the majority of Americans support these strikes, support the guilds. I would like to see a swift end to the strikes, but that's on the AMPTP actually coming to the table with a reasonable offer. And, we'll see how that goes. Hey, thanks for watching. I'm trying to get my channel monetized, so your view means a lot. Don't forget to toss me a like and subscribe and ring the bell. I stream every Monday and Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific, so catch me live and join in on the convo. You can find all my socials in the description below, and thank you to all my patrons with a special shout out to Piftle Cakes and Ryan D. Your support means the world. Catch you next time.